Good evening, everyone. My name is Kay Kendall, and I'm the chair of the District of Columbia Commission on Arts and Humanities, and I'm here to welcome you to our event tonight. Thank you very much for coming. Every year, the Commission is very honored and proud to be able to support artists and organizations that have programs that highlight Black history during Black History Month. This history is really vital to our citizens, both here as a part of our history in the district, and of course for the whole nation. Tonight, I think it's especially exciting that we're able to shine a light on Frederick Douglass, a man of extraordinary vision, a real legend, and especially on the occasion of his 200th birthday. I want to take a moment to thank some of the other commissioners who serve with me on the Commission of Arts and Humanities who are here tonight. Edmund Fleet, Mariah Rooney, Lawrence Green, and Haley Francis. I think they're all here. Thank you all for coming. I also want to thank our mayor, Muriel Bowser. She's very generous to the arts, and it's because of that that we're able to support arts in our community. We are joined tonight by two key partner agencies. Please join me in welcoming the Director of the Mayor's Office on African Affairs, Mamadou Samba, and the Director of African American Affairs, Rahman Branch. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I prefer to be true to myself, even as a hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than being false and to incur my own ignorance. This is my favorite Frederick Douglass quote that when Director Espinosa asked me to share, I did not hesitate, because this is, to me, this is the quote that not only connects me to the man and the legacy, but as an immigrant, a man who dedicated his entire life, born a slave, to fight for freedom, not only for women, minorities, but also for immigrants. To me, this is the one quote that connects me to the man and the legacy. My name is Mamadou Samba, and I'm the Director of the Mayor's Office on African Affairs. And on behalf of the Mayor, our partner agencies, Director Espinosa, Rahman Branch, I'd like to thank the Commission for including us in this event. And I'd like to thank and wish everybody a happy Black History Month. Black History Month is my favorite time of the year. And for the past 3 years, we partnered and hosted so many great events with the Commission and Rahman Branch. And it's one of those events that is not only my favorite of the year, but tonight's event celebrating the 200th birthday of Frederick Douglass is very similar to me to when I was younger and the day that Nelson Mandela was freed from prison. And so I'm just honored to be here to celebrate this memorable event with you guys and the entire community. It is my pleasure to introduce Rahman Branch. I've asked him, what do you want me to say about you? He said 3 things. The first thing he said is, I'm 345 pounds, so be careful, don't mess me up, right? The second thing is, he's a man of the community, and I know this very well. And the last thing he said is, he leads and honors his family with the teachings of Frederick Douglass, and that's a perfect way to introduce him. Rahman Branch.
So there are a couple of things that come to mind for an event like this. I think the first one, and I am trying really hard not to misquote, is it's not the rain, but the thunderstorm. It's not the light we need, but the fire. That's a conversation that I have with my young people all the time at home when I talk about what our job is as a people. My name is Rahman Branch. I'm the Director of the Mayor's Office on African American Affairs. And being a relatively new office here in the district, one of the things that we're very mindful of is the necessity of the intentional inclusion of African Americans in the progress that the city's experiencing. So yeah, you can clap for that, absolutely. And we're working extremely diligently on making sure that, this humble mumble of an office becomes, a very loud roar. When it comes to my favorite Douglass quote, before this I was an educator and I exist in that world all the time, and it's probably one that most people know, where it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I think that's, especially given where we are, that's something that's extremely important to focus on these days. I'm very grateful to the Commission and Director Espinoza for inviting us to come to this. The alignment is perfect, given that Mamadou and the Office of African Affairs, my office and the Office of African American Affairs, and the work that we do with MOLA and the Commission, who's always been a strong partner, not just in having creative expressions for the public, but really supporting the efforts for our three offices, African Affairs, African American, and MOLA, to really look at the connectedness of the diaspora between all three of our offices and the connectedness of the communities that we serve. Arthur and the Commission have been great supporters of that, so I'm very grateful for him including us in these events as well. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're looking for an opportunity to work with and support us, moaa.dc.gov. Shameless plug. And so, we just want to be, we're grateful to have us here tonight. But the opportunity is now here where I get the pleasure of, really directly honoring the gentleman who helped make sure all the cool things our offices want to create, all the things we want to collaborate on when we need support and we're looking for someone to get our backs. It's never a problem to place a phone call, and his answer is always, "Hey, Rock, what do you need? We got you, no problem." He helps these things occur. An awesome individual and a great supporter of both of our offices, Director Arthur Espinoza.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Directors Branch and Samba. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate your presence here. And being a part of this program is really important to us. I am Arthur Espinoza. I am the Executive Director of the District of Columbia Commission on the Arts and Humanities. And there's a few people I want to thank before we get started. And one of those is Joy Ford Austin, who is the Director of Humanities DC, who is critical in helping us put this together, gave us some great ideas, and I think she's here. Let's give her a round of applause for her help and support. But I would ask that you also help me in welcoming a very special guest. She is 96 years old, and she made it out here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Aunt Thelma. We're so glad to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank Chair Kay Kendall and the commissioners on the Commission on the Arts and Humanities for their continued support and their effort to help all of our work. We're almost done with all this talking, and then we'll get to, well, quite frankly, more talking, but better talking. So before I do, just a couple of remarks. I do want to thank all of the artists that you'll enjoy this evening, our presenters, and of course I want to thank the staff of the Commission on the Arts and Humanities who work so hard all year round to do all of our programs, our grant making, many of the things that just make this work for all of us. And if you'll join me in giving them all a round of applause. But especially, I want to thank our events manager, Ebony Brown, and Jakenna Martin, who's our events assistant. We really can't do it without them. I think they did a fantastic job. Looks good up here, and it will sound good, and you'll enjoy this evening, and it'll be because of their hard work. I would also like to thank the mayor for her continued support. As Chair Kendall mentioned, it is critical to have the support of the mayor, and she has been so helpful in all of our programs in ensuring that there is a place for our creative expressions throughout the district by supporting the agency's efforts. So continued thanks to Mayor Bowser for her wonderful support. So now let's get on with the rest of the evening. It's my pleasure to welcome our moderator for this evening. Please join me in welcoming WUSA 9's Delia Gonçalves.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Arthur. What a good-looking crowd. I'm so happy to see everyone here. I'm really excited, honored that I got the call from Arthur to come celebrate with all of you and moderate tonight's event. I especially feel connected to Frederick Douglass. Can I share? 2 reasons. One, I proudly live in Southeast, just miles away from the Frederick Douglass home. A round of applause for Southeast. I see some neighbors here in the crowd. And I'm originally from New Bedford, Massachusetts, where we know Frederick Douglass and his wife settled and eventually raised their family. So I grew up hearing the stories and seeing the murals of Frederick Douglass, this amazing man, all my life. And I'm really excited to learn, like all of you, more about this amazing person. And we have an outstanding lineup of artists and presenters and some really impressive scholars who will break things down for us. So get comfy. We're going to have a great night of learning and celebrating the life of Frederick Douglass. So we're going to take you on a journey tonight. A journey to the past, to the present, through dialogue, music, literature, and film. It is our hope that you may hear or see something that will resonate with you and will remind you that we should all exercise compassion towards one another. And I think that is something in light of the last few days, what we've seen bombarded across our television screens and we've been hearing on our radios. We need some compassion. And so tonight is a night of healing, a night of reflection, and I'm hoping that we can all walk away enlightened and with a clearer vision of what we need to do to make sure we have a brighter future for all our children. Now, without further delay, let's take a look at our first film clip of Enslavement to Emancipation.
Gonna take a trip this evening. Gonna go way back home. Gonna look at your past this evening. Listen to me, the slaves talk about it.
Imagine being kidnapped or sold into captivity, forced into submission through violent beatings, torture, and intimidation. Sold on the auction block to the highest bidder, and being forced to work for free under the most cruel, deplorable conditions. And it's all perfectly legal. This was the existence for blacks enduring the horrific institution of enslavement in our nation's early years. For enslaved blacks, it was more than being forced to work without compensation, but a way of life, reaching every crack and crevice of human existence.
After 1620, when indentured servitude was changed into the permanent state of slavery, permanent state of the institution of slavery, the Virginia colonists passed a series of laws that are called the slave codes. And these slave codes are codified into law to restrict and prohibit enslaved people from having access to government, from having access to private enterprise, as well as prohibiting enslaved people from having relationship between wife to husband, husband to children, and subsequently the ownership of property. It's complete prohibition in every phase of life to control and maintain enslaved people as property of slave owners or slave masters.
Just as the District of Columbia, our nation's capital, was carved out of land from Maryland and Virginia, so too were its slave laws. But by the early to mid-1800s, with the number of free blacks growing in the district and the anti-slavery movement picking up steam, the climate in our nation's capital began to change.
We, as the human race, should never suppress, never enslave, never oppress, and never treat our fellow humans indifferent. The lesson from this is that freedom, liberation, equality, and justice should be for all, and oppression and slavery for none.
As a symbolic center of a young nation, the struggle to end slavery in the District of Columbia had more meaning than in any other place in the Union.
Slavery in the District of Columbia is significant because Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. This was not lost on slaveholders, it wasn't lost on the abolitionists, nor was it lost on the enslaved population and the free black population. They realized that the fight for emancipation in the district would be a fight for freedom throughout the United States.
In 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded in Philadelphia. Its members flooded Congress with thousands of petitions demanding an end to slavery and the slave trade in the district. Hoping to avoid a brutal showdown on Capitol Hill, members of the House of Representatives devised a strategy known as the gag rule, which automatically postponed or tabled any petitions on the over 100,000 anti-slavery petitions sent to the House of Representatives.
We have scores of petitions and memorials that were received by Congress from progressive white communities, from African Americans. We have letters and so forth. So that is a battle that went from the designation of Washington, D.C. as the national capital.
Former President John Quincy Adams, then in his 70s, began a 9-year battle against the gag rule, which was finally repealed in 1844. While the legislative battle against slavery raged on Capitol Hill, freed blacks and white abolitionists in the district played a critical role in a clandestine effort to move enslaved persons to freedom, known as the Underground Railroad.
The Chesapeake, I'm talking about Virginia, Maryland, D.C., and Delaware, the Upper South, is the pathway from slavery to freedom, because you have an area in which individuals, black and white, are going to actively aid those seeking freedom. All they have to do is to get across the Potomac or somehow catch a boat across the bay, get to Baltimore, and from there they can go to Delaware, they can make it to Philadelphia, they can make it to New Jersey, they can make it to New York.
Among the many African Americans in Washington who risked their lives hiding fugitive slaves was Anthony Bowen. Bowen was born enslaved in Maryland in 1805. He later moved to Washington, where as a young man he purchased his freedom in 1830 for $425. A dedicated abolitionist and religious leader, Bowen met freedom seekers at the 6th Street Wharf and sheltered them in his home, which served as an important stop along the Underground Railroad.
Washingtonians worked to guarantee freedom, not just for themselves, but for individuals like my great-great-grandfather, a slave in Virginia. They made freedom real for individuals all over the nation.
In 1853, Bowen organized the nation's first African-American YMCA in Washington. Throughout the early 1800s, the brutality of the institution of slavery was routinely on display in the nation's capital. The markets that sprang up in Washington, D.C. formed the busiest area in the country for the buying and selling of slaves. For abolitionists, the slave markets located in the center of the nation represented what they called the national shame.
This practice of purchasing and selling slaves in the district had become an embarrassment for the national government. And many, many Europeans, as visitors to the nation's capital, took this nation to task to see this heart-wrenching selling of individuals, separating children from mothers. It was very difficult.
Although opponents to slavery were ever more vocal, slavery in the District of Columbia continued throughout the early 1800s. By 1835, however, those who held people enslaved were increasingly concerned by a series of insurrections and escape attempts. Memories were still fresh of Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion, just 180 miles south of D.C. in Southampton, Virginia. Turner and a band of runaway slaves had killed upwards of 50 white people with axes before it all came to an end. The violent and dramatic incident was now on the minds of the residents of the district. In August of that year, a peculiar confrontation between an 18-year-old slave named Arthur Bowen and a 60-year-old white socialite named Mrs. Anna Marie Thornton set off a series of explosive events.
One evening, after engaging in a debate at the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, Arthur Bowen was inebriated at the time and was walking into the house. And as he walked into the house, he picked up an axe and put it on his arm as he was walking in. Anna Marie Thornton, Marie Bowen, who was Arthur Bowen's mother, was in the bedroom. And when he walked in, he startled them. And as a result of startling them, Anna Marie Thornton rushes out of the house, and she was met by the physician of Andrew Jackson. And she shared the story of Arthur Bowen walking into the house with an axe under his arm. Then it becomes a part of an alleged attack on the mistress, Anna Marie Thornton, which created the chaos and the havoc that took place, known as the Snow Riot of 1835 here in the District of Columbia.
The alleged attack became just one of several sparks that would soon set off an outbreak of violence in the nation's capital.
Once Arthur Bowen is captured and incarcerated at the D.C. jail, which was located in Judiciary Square, the Irish mechanics, who were angry because they felt that the enslaved persons were taking jobs away from them, and with the backdrop of the Nat Turner insurrection of 1831, and to avenge the alleged attack on Anna Marie Thornton, they wanted to get Arthur Bowen out of jail and then hang him. The policemen prohibited the mechanics from gaining access to Arthur Bowen. So subsequently, they marched down the street to 6th and Pennsylvania Avenue. They destroyed the restaurant of Beverly Snow because they could not gain access to Arthur Bowen. One has to realize that by 1835, the number of African Americans who were free outnumbered the number of enslaved African Americans in the district. So that played into the attitude and the behavior of the Irish mechanics. Let me just emphasize that during this period, mechanics are basically laborers in the city, general laborers in the city. And so they waged this campaign of terror on Beverly Snow as an example or as a symbol to suppress the abolitionist movement, to suppress the movement for freedom, liberation, and equality and emancipation. So therefore, Beverly Snow's restaurant becomes a symbol of their attack. Arthur Bowen was found guilty of attempted murder on Anna Marie Thornton. Anna Marie Thornton knew and felt that Arthur Bowen truly was not trying to attack her. And she started a petition to free Arthur Bowen. Through that petition, Andrew Jackson stayed the execution 3 times. On the 3rd appeal from Anna Marie Thornton, he pardoned Arthur Bowen. And this is the role that he played in the Snow Riot of 1835, which should probably have been called the Arthur Bowen Riot rather than the Beverly Snow Riot, because it was more about Arthur Bowen than it was about Beverly Snow.
Wasn't that an enlightening film? Who learned something new? I won't quiz you. I won't ask questions. I won't put you on the spot. It's been a long week for everyone. But I think being here in this space, in the historic Lincoln Theater, watching these incredible clips, what a great happy hour, right? What a great way to end the week, refreshed and renewed for the weekend. So I'm really excited to kick off to our next portion of the event, which is our panel discussion. But before I do, I should remind you that we are here to all celebrate and commemorate the bicentennial of Frederick Douglass. And while the film Enslavement to Emancipation does not specifically focus on Frederick Douglass, I think we can all agree that his profound life as a slave and abolitionist certainly relates to what we will be talking about and is pertinent to this conversation. So we'll take a look at some of Douglass's most notable quotes in relation to the film, and we'll use those quotes throughout the evening to guide us in our discussion. So with that being said, I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage an esteemed cast of characters, some of DC's own scholars in African and African American history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Namada Blyden, Associate Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University. Dr. Mohammed Kamara, Chair of the Department of African Studies, Howard University.
Thank you.
Charles Hicks, Director of the DC Black History Celebration Committee. Dr. Leslie Hinkson, Assistant Professor of Sociology and African American Studies, Georgetown University. And finally, a round of applause for Dr. Frank Smith. He is the founder of the African American Civil War Memorial and Museum. Our panel. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone looks lovely and geared up for a really great conversation. So our chairs are comfy. Folks outside in the audience are comfortable as well. So we're family. So let's just have a conversation tonight. Let's start off with a quote. We're going to start with a quote, then we'll have conversation. So we'll start with a quote to kick things off, and I think it really speaks to the incredible strength and resilience of who we are. Before we move into the conversation on the institution of slavery, though, I want to look at this from the aspect of really understanding what actually transpired during the Middle Passage. I'm a first-generation Cape Verdean American. I have been told from my parents and from family members the role that Cape Verde Islands played in the transatlantic slave trade. But certainly there's a whole lot more to know and to learn. So could you enlighten us, and I guess I'll just open it up to the panel, on some of the systems, the roots, the conditions of the transatlantic slave trade?
So when I teach my students, when I talk to my students about the transatlantic slave trade, they come at it from having learned it as Europeans came, took Africans, the Middle Passage, and then they were in the Americas. And I try to get them to think of the experience of Africans before they end up in the Americas as a series of Middle Passages. Right? Mm-hmm. So the Middle Passage is not just that voyage across the seas. It's from the moment of capture, the many passages on foot to the coast, sitting in a slave barracoon for weeks, months, coasting down on a slave ship as they pick up more and more slaves before the actual voyage across the sea, right? So I ask them to think about how does that shape an individual? That's the way I think. And what does that make of a person who then ends up here to begin another kind of ordeal?
I think, with the wonderful museum, the African American Museum of History and Culture, that just opened up people's eyes to the intricacies and the detail of the slave trade and the travel, the conditions. Anything that perhaps we did not know or was not well publicized or we haven't learned over time?
I think one of the pieces that I think about often is that horrible journey. And when I talk to people about it, I like for people to imagine that when you're chained together so tight like sardines in a can, and that if you die during the night, you're left there for 2 or 3 days until it's time to bring you back up. or if you have to go to the bathroom, there's no place to go except for where you are. But the other piece that I think about in this horrible journey is the strength of so many Africans who decided, I will not be a slave, that I will jump overboard. I will stay in Africa. My roots are in Africa, and I will be in Africa. But I think it's important that we understand the courage that it took to make this journey, and that this journey was one that was a day of no return, basically. And it was an incredible journey from being captured to not knowing where you were going, to not knowing where you were going to land and where you were going to go. But the conditions, I know where you were on those ships and the amount of time it took you. And at times, all they did was bring you up and throw cold water on you every so often to wash you off and take you back and chain you back together. And that's an incredible thought process. If you can just imagine yourself going through that for an enormous amount of time. And you didn't know how long it was going to be. It wasn't like it was going to be 2 weeks. It seemed like a forever journey. And that there's an amazing amount of strength, I think, that our ancestors had to make that journey under the circumstances.
Absolutely.
And the museum, when you go down there, if you have the time, because you need a week to do the whole museum, but if you go down, when you go down to the ship, and you spend time in that ship, by the time you come out of that ship, you are so wrecked, you are so exhausted. And I would urge anybody who's not done that to do that, to get that feeling, that understanding of from whence we've come.
It's an emotional journey. Let's pause for a moment so we can take a look at our first quote from Frederick Douglass, and we'll continue our conversation.
Go where you may, search where you will, roam through the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for every revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
Before we paused, you wanted to say one thing.
Oh, no, I was just going to comment on it. You asked the question about what we've learned, what we may have learned from the museum that we may not have known before. I think there's one thing that we still don't know, and it's just left to our imagination, right? Because there's no real record of it. One of the things that I think is really lost is, and I think you were alluding to it, it's this idea of what was the mental state, right? I mean, can you imagine you're taken from a place, right? And the conditions are conditions that you would never imagine another human being would be in. And you never know if it's going to end. You don't know if you're going to survive. You don't know if you want to survive, and you don't know what's going to lay before you. And you're probably in terror the entire time. So can you imagine being in a state of terror like that for such a long time, what that does to your mind, what that does to your body, and whether it was intentional or not? I mean, I guess part of that process was trying to turn men, women, boys, and girls into slaves, right? I think that was a huge part of what that whole process of carrying human beings in such a barbaric way across an ocean was meant to do.
And that's why novels such as Roots or the Book of Negroes resonate, right? Because in fictional form, we're able to imagine that experience, which we'll never know.
Or homegoing.
And I think following up on that discussion of the mental state of those Africans who were enslaved that we can only imagine today. I remember back in 1992, I had the opportunity to interview the then curator of the slave house on Gorée, Mr. Joseph Boubacar Ndiaye. he said that since the museum had opened, he had seen a lot of great African American leaders coming to Gorée and practically worshiping the land of Africa, the last piece of land where their ancestors were shackled, imprisoned, and meant the real form of slavery beginning right then and there. And he said something that really I think is very fitting here, since we're talking about Frederick Douglass. He said that every time he saw an African American, be that the Reverend Jesse Jackson at that time, or an African American Hollywood star, or a business person, whoever they happen to be, he said he saw a Frederick Douglass, someone freeing themselves from the shackles of real or mythical slavery to come to the homeland and say, here I am. And he explained that when you went to, when you think of Gorée, that slave house where the ancestors of today's African Americans, many of whom were brought down there in that same building and first experienced the mistreatment of coming through slavery, he said, you can never imagine how these people felt. Because let's not forget that in pre-colonial Africa, there were no prisons. Africans didn't have a concept or didn't accept a concept of voluntary confinement of a human being. So imagine those who were brought into Gorée or Elmina and other slave houses where sometimes they would have to wait, shackled, confined in small rooms, men, women, children, for weeks and months before even going through the door of no return and being put on those ships that we just discussed. So putting all that together from an African perspective, every time Africans walk into Gorée and Elmina, they have that imagination. What happened to our people when they left?
Have you visited?
Could I add a few words into that myself?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that there's one other thing that has to be said also, and that is that many of these persons who were enslaved and brought to the United States were part of a warrior class in Africa. Many of these people are obtained as a result of these tribes fighting each other. And we know from our own Dearborn experience that we send our best in the battle. So you get one side capture another, and then they're selling them off to these Europeans who are being brought to the States. So you've got members of that warrior class who are being brought here to the United States, descendants of which eventually end up in the Union Army in the Civil War, many of whom have their names on our Wall of Honor at the African American Civil War Memorial. If they had not survived this passage, they wouldn't have been here in the United States. And this whole class of people that we now know that delivered Barack Obama to the White House wouldn't have been here. So I think that's an important thing to remember, that many of these people were survivors to start with because they were warriors. And they were like Harriet Tubman. They had to figure out how to survive, even on these horrible slave ships in this long travel. They did it, and when they came to America, they made a life for themselves. And every opportunity they got, they ran away to freedom, or they did whatever they did. And when Lincoln finally said they could join the Union Army, 200,000 of them joined the Union Army, 13 of which went the Congressional Medal of Honor. So this is a warrior class, which has done something remarkable here in the United States, primarily because they were able to, they started out as a warrior class in Africa.
I have found that to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man.
Before we move on, because I'm a reporter and I go with the moment, with the feeling, with the emotion. And I feel like before we pivoted to the next quote, there was some emotion about being in that last place, about what our ancestors endured. Have you been personally yourself?
To Gore? Yes.
And what was that like? What were your thoughts when you were in that final place?
Being a reporter, you also certainly understand that sometimes, because I was a journalist also, sometimes we tend to censor ourselves inside to try to disconnect the intellectual, professional, individual from the emotional soul inside. So you fighting yourself to not be quote unquote contaminated by your emotions. So because I was doing research for the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, I had to fight to separate myself from there. But as we started walking through the different rooms of the museum itself and walking upstairs to where the slave owners or the slave traders, the Europeans, would be living upstairs, and all of downstairs would be this huge cave where the Africans, remember, they're not slaves yet. They are captured, and they are imprisoned on their motherland.
Yeah.
Waiting for something they couldn't even imagine. So as we were walking around there, showing you some of the pictures and the artifacts, the shackles, and all those things, believe me, your intellectual professionalism is going to fail if you try to continue fighting your emotional self, because that is the raw presentation and representation of what Africans went through before even embarking on those slave ships and going through the Middle Passage. And in West Africa, we have this saying that before the Middle Passage, there was the non-passage, when you didn't know what was happening to you.
Yeah.
You just left your family about a few miles back, a few hours back, and you have no idea where you're going, and still yet you know you are in Africa. So yes, the emotions were there, and I have seen very tough guys cry.
Fall to their knees.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a sign of weakness. I believe it's a sign of self-recognition and recognizing yourself in the shoes of those men and women and children centuries ago who were subjected to that.
If I could piggyback on that, I last summer visited Elmina and Cape Coast, and Cape Coast had an exhibit done by a Ghanaian artist of thousands of sculpted heads. They were made out of clay, but each one was an individualized face of men and women and children. And they put them in the dungeons. And I'm a historian, so I come with objectivity too, although that I didn't go to do scholarship. And it was scary, is the only way I could use to describe it, because it wasn't going into an empty dungeon, which is what I did when I went to Gore. It was actually going into a dungeon with people. These heads were just, faces of people staring at you. And then also the recognition that you're walking on people's graves.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a very powerful experience.
Is it anger? Is it despair? Is it sadness?
It's a combination of so many things, and including hope. right? Because you recognize that some of those heads, let's call them the heads, or that some of those people ended up on this side. So it's the resilience and the hope and the history that came after also. So, you know, there's a little bit of uplift as well to recognize that all was not lost.
Let's talk about some of the differences of the American institution of slavery in comparison with the ancient slavery and slavery in other regions.
Okay, let me take that one to start with.
Sure.
Slavery is an very old system. In antiquity, in ancient Rome and Greece and other places, there was slavery. If you owed somebody some money, you could sell your own child to them, and they could stay there till they work off the debt. In all of those cultures, slavery was very different than the way it was in the United States, where a kid follows the condition of the mother. So you're a slave, your child is born a slave, doesn't matter who the father is. So it was very different, very different in some respects in those days. And as a matter of fact, once your period of servitude was over with, your slavery days were over with, you regained all your rights of citizenship, which was different than what happened in the United States and ancient Europe. You regained all your rights of citizenship except one thing. You could never be a soldier. You could never become a warrior if you'd ever been a slave. With the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, Abraham Lincoln armed the slaves, put them in the Union Army, and they fought for their freedom. This is ahistorical. First time in the history of the world, African Americans who've been enslaved for generations become soldiers. And at the end of that war, Congress says they earned their right to freedom on the battlefield. They fought their right to citizenship on the battlefield. They fought their right to voting on the battlefield. Very interesting way to look at this. This is a story we have to tell ourselves about what happened here in the United States, because that is really what happened to this warrior class that I talked about that starts out in Africa that ends up in the United States and have to prove their manhood and their womanhood and their right to citizenship all over again.
Let's pivot to take a look at our next quote here from Frederick Douglass.
So I was looking at it as he was speaking, in the way that he talks about what you have to do to make a person a slave, right? An enslaved person a slave, right? And you know, that last line, he must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceased to be a man. And that's what slavery does, no matter where it is, right? In different forms, with different kind of treatment. But this creating a person who thinks that that is his status, that slavery is right, is, I think, if, you know, we all disagree on how we want to define slavery, because it exists in different ways in different places, but I think it's that makes a slave no matter where he or she is, and no matter how he or she is treated. Fountain Hughes, right? I was treated, you know, my masters never beat me, they fed me, they clothed me, but if I ever thought I would be a slave again, I would shoot myself. He wasn't talking about treatment. He was talking about a condition of not being able to choose his own destiny.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in. I'm not a historian. I'm a sociologist, and I think for me, one of the seminal works on slavery out there is what was at first Orlando Patterson's doctoral dissertation turned into his great tome, Slavery and Social Death. And you know, in some ways, his work kind of corroborates this. But one of the things that I think Patterson adds to this is one of the ways in which another way in which you can make a slave is to make the slave believe that if he or she just does whatever it is the master says, they could one day gain their freedom. And it's not just about physical freedom, it's about regaining social life, right? Because to be an enslaved person, at least in the American institution of slavery, is to be a person without any honor, no social honor, right? And that sort of condition of extreme debasement, I mean, of course, no human being wants to live in that condition, right? And so you do whatever it is you feel you need to do, no matter how debasing, because one day you might get to that state in which you can regain social life. And that's one of the things that Patterson writes is so brilliant about the American institution of slavery, is because it is this like sort of self-reinforcing system, because all people want to be free, right? In order to gain your freedom, you must accept your enslavement. I mean, it's, you know, meta, as the young ones say. So.
Let's pause. I'm sorry to interrupt, but let's pause and so we can move our conversation along. Let's take a look at our next quote.
I prayed for freedom for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs.
That was a popular one. Break that down for us. What does that mean to you?
Well, let me take the other one and pivot into this one too.
Okay.
I read a diary that was done by a Quaker who was commissioned to go into Mississippi, to Natchez, Mississippi, to help organize an African-American regiment during the Civil War. And he said in his diary that he was surprised as a white man. He said he was surprised at some of the things he saw on this plantation. And what were those two things? He said he was surprised at how much mutilation and how much beating and how many people he saw in shackles, people who had feet cut off and ears, men who were wearing those things on their heads, how much brutality it kept to keep these people in slavery. These people did not want to be slaves, and they were all doing all kinds of things, including running away. He was surprised at that. He was also surprised at how many mulatto children he saw running around on his plantation. And he said, God is going to punish these people for what they did. So, yes, those people were waiting on an opportunity to get their freedom. It wasn't long before they joined the Union Army, before they found their legs, as Douglass says, with bullets in their pockets and rifles on their shoulders and U.S. on their lapel, 50,000 of them standing on the banks of the Mississippi River saying, we want to be free.
The bravery, the courage it took to use your legs, to race towards your freedom.
But I would say it also took luck, right?
Yeah.
To get to freedom, right? It took luck. It took people being willing to risk their lives, right? In order to help you out. It took people with resources. You know, I'm a huge fan of Frederick Douglass, but every once in a while, when I read some of these quotes, I think to myself, you know, there were thousands of people before Douglass who tried to use their legs, right, rather than pray, and didn't make it. And so I think that my point is, it is great to praise him, right? And it is great to laud the bravery of those who made it to freedom, right? But there were many more who were just as brave, if not braver, who never made it. And there were many who were just as brave or braver who stuck it out because, for example, if you're a mother, right, you're not going to leave your child behind, right?
There were some tough decisions to be made. Let's take a look at our next quote.
Grandmother pointed out my brother Perry, my sister Sarah, and my sister Eliza, who stood in the group. I had never seen my brother nor my sisters before, and though I had sometimes heard of them and felt a curious interest in them, I really did not understand what they were to me or I to them. We were brothers and sisters, but what of that? Why should they be attached to me or I to them? Brothers and sisters were by blood, but slavery had made us strangers. I heard the words brothers and sisters and knew they must mean something. But slavery had robbed these terms of their true meaning.
Families were ripped apart. Brother, sister, mother, child.
But I think also, while families were ripped apart, sometimes families were recreated. I think that's one of our traditions.
So that's another interpretation at looking at it, at the situation.
And that, even when I was growing up, 70-some years ago, I can remember that people would take in a child. And so when a slave mother was sold and a child was left there, somebody took that child. And I think that sometimes you did not have an identification with brothers and sisters. Sometimes, just like slave men didn't have a connection with all their families because they were moved from one place to another because they were studs. But it doesn't mean that they did not find some relationship, some emotionalness, and some closeness to bring together what we call, or what they call a family back then in whatever sense it was. If it was no more than just being able to have a place where you could go, somebody could tell you something, or a baby could lay in your arms, and you could nurse that child while she was in the field or whatever. So I think there were different definitions of how we assume family to mean family then as we do now, but that we've always had a sense of trying to do for each other what we could do, because I think that was part of one of the things that slavery made us realize is that we had a belief at some point or another that this was not right, that we were in a situation that was not right, and that one day we would make it right, it would change over. And so there was an idea that people, if not for themselves, for their children or for that little boy in the field, that one day it would be right for him. And so while we didn't always connect with brothers as brothers and sisters as sisters, there was still a connection of caring that we've always had in our communities about caring for each other and wherever we were.
I hate to cut you off. We are having a lively, wonderful discussion, but I think the show must go on, as they say, right? So we're going to pause here. Thank you so much. A round of applause for our panel. And we will bring you back after watching another clip of our film. So thank you so much. You can come back in just a bit. I appreciate your time. Weren't they wonderful, folks? Great conversation. Now let's take a look at the next film before we move into a live portrayal, and this is going to be a treat, of Frederick Douglass and a performance from members of the Washington National Opera's K-Fritz Young Artists.
In 1848, the District of Columbia was home to a combustible mix of slaves, freed blacks, pro-slavery whites, and abolitionists. It was also the setting for the single largest attempted slave escape in U.S. history, a daring and dramatic bid for freedom aboard the Pearl.
It's very hard to have any precise picture, but it is estimated that throughout the country, about 1,000 slaves per year either ran away or tried to run away. But the penalty for running away was very high, very high. Sometimes if they lived in the Upper South where life was not too hard, they were sold to New Orleans. Sometimes they were beaten viciously.
Nearly 37,000 people lived in the district at that time. About 8,000 of them were free black people, and 4,000 were slaves. Some tried to buy their freedom. Others tried to run away, often by way of the Underground Railroad. William Chaplin, a radical abolitionist known for helping several slaves escape, was enlisted by a free black couple, Daniel and Mary Bell, who were trying to secure the freedom of their own children. It was the Bells who initiated the planning for the Pearl escape.
When the Bells asked him to arrange for 10, this was a very large number and very difficult. And this is why he asked a man he knew in Philadelphia to arrange for a ship, and that's how the Pearl got involved.
That Philadelphia man was Daniel Drayton, a ship's captain who once helped a family of 6 slaves escape.
Daniel Drayton himself was a Methodist who had become alienated from the Methodist Church because he felt they did not try to end slavery. He had a large family. He realized that they were in want, and for that reason, he most reluctantly accepted the $100 offered to him for bringing off the slaves. He knew how dangerous it was.
Drayton sought the help of Edmund Sayers, also a ship's captain, who owned a schooner called the Pearl. Reduced to using the Pearl for hauling and selling coal, Sayers reluctantly agreed to come to Washington because he needed the $100. Paul Edmondson, a free black man and father of another large family of slaves, was also seeking freedom for his children aboard the Pearl. Because his wife Amelia was a slave, all 14 of her children were legally slaves also. And as soon as the children reached the appropriate age, their owner rented them out.
It was because they were rented out in Washington that they heard about a ship coming to take the Bell family to freedom. And so they approached Chaplin and said, could we get on board the ship? And so they were among the people who waited with bated breath to find out whether or not they would be allowed to get on board the Pearl. When Drayton said, I'll take anybody that wants to come, the Edmondsons were among the first to get on board. That night, 76 slaves, men, women, and children, slipped down to the ship and got on board. I think so often of how desperate people were to achieve freedom. Because think of what the Pearl was like. It was a broken-down old schooner. It had been hauling coal. Nobody did anything to clean it up, and yet they were grateful. They were willing, they were anxious to get on board.
So on the evening of April 15, 1848, the passengers aboard the Pearl, old and young, male and female, mothers with children, set sail on a daring 225-mile quest for freedom. But by daylight, their slave owners realized something was amiss.
They recognized the next morning, because all of the things that domestic slaves were supposed to do had not been done. They were absolutely furious.
A posse soon formed and set out in a steamboat on the Potomac to capture the runaway slaves.
When the steamboat saw the Pearl, there was much shouting and hallelujahing because they had found the ship that they were looking for.
Drayton and Sayers were taken on board the steamboat, and the Pearl was tugged back up the Potomac to Washington, where they anchored at the foot of 7th Street. But it was sisters Mary and Emily Edmondson who later would become the Pearl's most famous passengers.
As they marched up 7th Street, this is in downtown Washington, the crowd grew much larger. By this time, the crowd had grown threatening. There were cries of, "Lynch 'em, lynch 'em, the damned villains." There were taunts and jeers at every step. According to another account, people were shouting, "Drag him out, knock his damned brains out, shoot him, shoot the hellhound." One of the bystanders is supposed to have said to fugitive Emily Edmondson, "Aren't you ashamed to run away and make all this trouble for everybody?" She replied, "No, sir, we are not, and if we had to go through it again, we'd do the same thing."
The runaway slaves were returned to their owners, and most of them were sold. But it was sisters Mary and Emily Edmondson who later would become the Pearl's most famous passengers. Drayton and Sayers were found guilty of transporting slaves for the purpose of escape and sentenced to long prison terms. But a few years later, President Millard Fillmore decided to pardon Drayton and Sayers. Yet after the Pearl's capture, Mary and Emily Edmondson and 4 of their brothers were quickly shipped off to the lucrative slave market of New Orleans. The brothers were easily sold, but Mary and Emily's story didn't end there.
They were beautiful, They were young, and they had lovely singing voices. And so it was assumed that they would be sold to be fancy girls in New Orleans. But then it appeared that they were in peril of catching whatever fever it was that was killing people in New Orleans. And so they were sent back, first to Baltimore and then to Alexandria, where they hoped that somebody would buy their freedom.
The Edmondson sisters were eventually freed and educated with the help of noted abolitionist Reverend Henry Ward Beecher and his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Though Mary died young, Emily Edmondson became an abolitionist herself and went on to work with Frederick Douglass and others. The human drama at the center of the attempted escape on the Pearl mirrored the deepening drama of the coming Civil War.
This was a terrible thing that had happened. It was a terrible thing because it had happened right next to the capital of the United States. And consequently, people all over the South were totally enraged. And I suspect this incident was one of the reasons that the search for fugitive slaves was really tightened up in a law that was passed known as the Compromise of 1850, which made it obligatory to help people recover the slaves. Now, also a part of that law was a measure providing that the slave trade would be ended in the district, not slavery. Slavery remained until 1862, but it was at least a recognition that there was, by this time in the United States, a growing opposition to the institution of slavery.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, oh Lord, a long ways from home. I've never met a slave who could tell me how old he was. Few slave mothers not knowing the month of the year nor the days of the month. They measure their age by winter time, springtime, planting time, harvest time. Like most slaves, I cannot tell you how old I am. My master allowed no questions to be put to him by which a slave would know his age. We are here, and here we are likely to be. To think that we would ever be eradicated is absurd and ridiculous. Therefore, I repeat, we are here, and this is our country. My name is Frederick Douglass. I was born February the 14th, 1818, so I was told, in Talbot County, Maryland. My mother, whom I only knew for a short while, was a slave. And my father, whom I never met, was a white man and a myth. I recall quite vividly when my mother would leave the plantation in the nights, walking 12 miles barefooted, just to be with me as I lived with my grandparents. She would hold me and rock me and hum. Until I fell asleep. In the mornings, she was gone. You see, if she didn't return by sunrise, she was beaten. My grandmother and grandfather raised me until I was 7 years old. And this particular day, my grandmother called me, "Frederick, boy, pack your things. We got somewhere to go." So I hurriedly packed my things. And then we walked this long road. And there it was, right there before my very own eyes. It was named the Y Plantation. You see, this plantation housed over 1,000 slaves. My grandmother took me there, took me to the back door, and seated me, and said, "You stay there now. I'll be right back momentarily, but you stay there." And so I did. I put my head on the table and went to sleep. That morning, I looked for her, and she wasn't there. And then I heard the screams and the cries. I ran to the door and looked outside. And there I saw white men, the slave masters, beating the women and the men. "All right, you nigger, you're lazy. All right, nigger, work." I didn't know what to do. I looked for my grandmother and couldn't find her. My heart started beating fast and faster. "Grandma!" I stayed on that plantation nearly 2 years. And then they sent me to Master U-All and his wife, Sophia, to watch their son, Thomas. And during that time, Sophia All taught me how to read letters every day in the parlor. And then Master Hugh All had learned what she was doing, and he walked into the room where we were and stood over top of us and shouted out, "Don't ever teach them how to read. Don't you ever teach them how to read. Once they learn how to read, they're free. Don't you ever teach them, not in my house." Well, she did stop teaching me, but by the time she did, I had already learned enough to continue to teach myself. Keep this in mind, that no one can ever keep you in the dark when you know how to read. And during that time, I was very fortunate to meet Uncle Lawson. I loved him dearly. He taught me how to read the Bible. And he reached out to me one day and said, "Frederick, Lord have mercy. One day, boy, you're going to be a man of the world. Just trust in the Lord. Just trust him." I didn't know what he meant at that time. But as the years progressed, I realized what he was saying to me. Knowing that I was indeed a threat to the master and others, by the time I was 16, they sent me to Edward Covey, Now, Edward Covey was a poor white farmer, but he was notoriously known as a slave breaker. And for 6 months of my life, he kicked me, beat me over and over again, whipped me. And I couldn't take it. And I was about to give in and give up until that defining day when he raised his hand for the very last time. And when he did, I grabbed his arm and we fought over, and then I tried my best to strangle him. And I said, "You'll never, never, ever beat me again." He was quiet. And rightfully so. From that time on, he never said anything to me. You see, he was a smart, poor white man. He never told anyone at all. He sent me to Master Freeland. Master Freeland was fairly nice to me. And while I was there, I was able to teach other slaves how to read the Bible. We planned several escapes, but unsuccessful. And so Master Freeland sent me to Master Hugh. Master Hugh sent me to Baltimore shipyard to become a corker. I was able to meet others who looked like me, and we talked about the possibility of freedom for us and what it would be like. While I was there working in the shipyards, I was very fortunate to meet the love of my life, Anna Murray. She was a free Negro, as free as a Negro could be. And so we discussed the possibility of being man and wife. She had saved up some money, quite some time, and then we talked about me escaping. And it happened. September the 3rd, 1838. I disguised myself as a sailor and went to New York. And once I arrived in New York, my name was Frederick Johnson. You see, there was a bounty on me, and so I had to change my name several times. I sent for Anna, and there we married under the name of Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Johnson. We didn't stay there that long. We finally left there, and then we went to New Bedford, New England. It was a wonderful experience for me. I saw people who looked like me walking about the streets and free, no chains on them at all. Nathan Johnson, a friend, read this book called Sir Walter the Lady of the Lake and said to me, "Frederick, this would be a good name for you, Douglass." And that's how I became Frederick Douglass. From that moment on, I worked odd jobs. Anna did as well. And then I was able to actually work around New England and speak in country schoolhouses and churches. And then finally I met William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist. He was the founder of the Liberator. And once I met Mr. William Lloyd Garrison, he didn't believe that I had been a slave because I was too articulate, he said. He took me to his colleagues and gave me the opportunity to speak. There was a man in the balcony after I completed my speech, and he said to me, "Frederick, how do we know that you have been a slave? You are too articulate." Do you want me to show you my backside and show you the whippings on my back? I know that I have experienced slavery. How dare you talk to me like that? He never said anything either. So from that moment on, I was able to speak in Ireland, Great Britain, and it was a wonderful journey. Two white women, paid over $700 for my freedom. And it was time for me to leave. William Lloyd Garrison and I had some indifferences, and so it was time for me to go. I moved to Rochester, New York, and stayed there for 25 years. You see, I believe that the American people are disposed to be generous rather than just. I look all over this country at this present time, and I see educational societies, sanitary commissions, freedmen's associations, and the like, all very good. But in regards to the colored people, there is always more that is benevolent I proceed to be just. What I ask for the Negro is not benevolence, not pity, not sympathy, but simple justice. Everyone is asking the question, and they learned to ask it early of the abolitionists. What shall we do with the Negro? Do nothing with us. If the apples do not remain on the tree of their own strength, if they're worm-eaten at the core and early ripe, then let them fall. And if the Negro cannot or will not stand on his own legs, let him fall also. Freedom is for all people and not for some. Yes.
Please welcome Washington National Opera's K-Fritz young artists, Christopher Kenny and Paul Jarsky.
skills. Amazing. One more round of applause. Christopher and Paul, beautiful performance. You know, I was in my dressing room and heard someone belting out some tunes, and little did I know, Christopher was right across the way. And how about that performance, Frederick Douglass by LeCount Holmes Jr.? Didn't I tell you Frederick Douglass lived in New Bedford? I did a little happy dance and celebrated backstage. I was all by myself, but I appreciate that shout out. So we're gonna hear more from Frederick Douglass a little later in our next segment, but first, let's get back to our film with this next clip of Enslavement to Emancipation. Enjoy.
Providing compensation to slave owners was not a new idea in 1862. In fact, as early as 1833, Great Britain abolished slavery and compensated slave owners for their freed slaves. The idea was tested in the nation's capital with the help of a dedicated abolitionist, Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson.
He was a man not only who empathized with enslaved people, and not only who was horrified by seeing it firsthand on his visits to the district, he deserves to be much better recognized, not only as the author of compensated emancipation in the district, but he would also go on to write the law that would smash the black codes in D.C. He would introduce the first post-Civil War civil rights legislation. He would be the 18th Vice President of the United States under Grant and chairman of the Military Affairs Committee of the Union during the Civil War. And yet, if you go to his grave, it's a plain stone sepulcher with no mention of all of these achievements.
Eventually, Wilson takes his passion to end slavery to Capitol Hill, where as a senator from Massachusetts, he introduces the District of Columbia Emancipation Act in December of 1861.
The mechanics of the Compensated Emancipation Act were relatively simple. The idea was that slave owners in the District of Columbia would submit essentially claims describing their enslaved persons. These claims and indeed the enslaved persons would be evaluated by a dealer in, of all places, Baltimore. Ultimately, slave owners got about an average of $300 per enslaved person. There were over 900 claimants,
Abraham Lincoln signed Wilson's act into law on April 16, 1862.
D.C. emancipation was celebrated as no other celebration in the African American community. It was the height of a social season for many years.
Freedom from enslavement in America involved many long and difficult struggles, slave rebellions, attempted escape, and even fighting and dying in a bloody war between the states.
The number of African Americans that fought in the Civil War was approximately 250,000. That would include United States colored troops, African Americans that fight in United States volunteer units, and in the U.S. Navy. The number of African Americans that lost their lives during the Civil War was approximately 40,000.
But wartime sacrifice did not end the struggle for full freedom and equality, nor with the enactment of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States, nor the 14th Amendment granting blacks their rights as citizens, and not even the 15th Amendment, which granted all men the right to vote. The conscription of black troops in the Civil War began a new chapter in the continuing struggle for freedom, equality, and justice.
When the Civil War began, it was not legal for men of African descent to join the Federal Army. In 1792, Congress had banned the enlistment of men of African descent into the Federal Army. In July of 1862, Congress gave President Lincoln the authority to recruit men of African descent into the Federal Army.
But just how were slaves of African descent convinced to fight in the Civil War? What were they promised? How did they fight? And most importantly, what did they gain?
How does the enslaved African American receive the news that he now has the opportunity to fight and win his freedom? With wild enthusiasm would be the words used by John S. Rock, the first African American to be admitted to the bar of the U.S. Supreme Court. It was with wild enthusiasm that these enslaved Americans could now join the Union Army, fight and win their own freedoms, but not only their own freedom, but the freedom of their own family. They could become the emancipators, the great emancipators, if you will, the liberators of their own families. This was an opportunity of a lifetime.
To assist recruitment efforts, abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote a newspaper editorial entitled Men of Color to Arms. Douglass urged blacks to earn their equality and show their patriotism by fighting in the Union cause. The Massachusetts 54th Regiment was the first black unit to be formed.
Two of his first recruits were his youngest son, Charles Douglass, and his eldest son, Lewis Douglass, who both enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts when it was first organized in February of 1863. His eldest son, Lewis Douglass, was quite skilled in drill when he got there, and he became the lead drill sergeant of the 54th Massachusetts. The order from the War Department, published in May of 1863, created a separate bureau of the U.S. Army. This separate bureau of the U.S. Army is where all the United States colored troop regiments were mustered into service. So even the 54th Massachusetts, which retains its state designation, was brought in to the Bureau of United States Colored Troops.
Although recruitment speeches promised black soldiers equality in the Union Army, they were not treated equally, yet they performed with distinction.
Their courage on the battlefield really changed the opinion of many Americans of European descent, because it was very clear after watching those soldiers on the battlefield that men of African descent could in fact fight. President Lincoln said that the war against the South could not have been won without the help of the black freedmen.
Back to the stage, LeCount Holmes Jr. as Frederick Douglass, followed by a performance from members of the National Symphony Orchestra.
Though the colored man is no longer subject to barter and sale, he is surrounded by adverse sentiment. If he comes in ignorance, rags, and wretchedness, he conforms to the popular belief of his character. And in that character, he is welcome. But if he comes as a gentleman, a scholar, or a statesman, he is hailed as a contradiction to the national faith concerning his race. And his coming is resented as impudence. In one case, he may provoke contempt and derision, but in the other, he is an affront to pride, provoking malice. It is now 1852. The Anti-Slavery Committee in Rochester has asked me to give a speech on behalf of the 4th of July. Needless to say that I find it quite interesting and quite odd. But nevertheless, I persevered. And so I gave my speech on July the 5th, 1852. Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, he who could address this audience without a quailing sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker more shrinkingly nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me, quite unfavorable, to the exercise of my limited powers of speech. The task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. I know that apologies of this sort are generally considered flat and unmeaning. I trust, however, that mine will not be so considered. Should I seem at ease, my appearance would much misrepresent me. The little experience I've had in addressing public meetings in country schoolhouses avails me nothing on the present occasion. The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way. For it is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence. But neither their familiar faces nor the perfect gauge I think I have of Corinthian Hall seems to free me from embarrassment. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic force in your government. The only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it, and yet you cling to it as if it were a sheet anchor to all your hopes. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, it is a day that reveals to him all other days the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, unholy license, your national greatness, your swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all of your religious parades, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, hypocrisy. A thin veil that would cover up crimes and would disgrace a nation of savages. There's not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Go where you may and search where you will. Roam through all the monarchies and despotisms. Travel through South America. Search out every abuse. And then lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation. And you will say with me, for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without rival. That was 1852, July the 5th, in Rochester, New York. Needless to say, they weren't too happy about what I had to say. But I said it. From that time on, and living in Rochester, many great experiences. I'm so fortunate with my family and many others who supported me during those years. But in 1872, I found out the bad news. I was in Washington, D.C. I found out that my house had burned down. I was very concerned and worried, needless to say. The main thing that I really wanted to know, that my family was all right. I rushed home as quickly as possible, and my family was certainly intact. But we lost much in our home in Rochester. Knowing that I was back and forth in Washington, D.C., I decided that it was time to move forward and moved to Washington. Again, many experiences, great experiences. We bought a home at 315 A Street near the Capitol. And then we learned of the house, what we named eventually Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C. A young boy, a young colored boy from the newspaper came to my home and said to me, "Mr. Douglass, sir, I would like to write a story about you. I want to tell all of your readers about you, sir, your journey and many other things. Please give me some of your time." Indeed, young man, it's been a long one. And so from there, I clearly thought. I looked into his eyes, and then I looked into the heavens, from whence cometh my help. The words, "Where there's no struggle, there's no progress." I escaped from slavery. Where there's no struggle, there's no progress. I learned how to read during a time that it was against the law for a person who looked like me to read. Where there's no struggle, there is no progress. I spoke around the world about my slavery experience. Where there's no struggle, there is no progress. I was nominated as the first Negro President of the United States of America. Where there's no struggle, there is no progress. I was nominated as the first Negro Vice President of the United States of America. Where there's no struggle, there is no progress. The first U.S. Negro Marshal of Washington, D.C. Where there's no struggle, there is no progress. The ambassador to Haiti, head of Recorder of Deeds. Where there's no struggle, there is no progress. I was the advisor to President Abraham Lincoln in getting our men to fight for our freedom. Where there's no struggle, there is no progress. And so, as I say to all of you and to this young man, we must never forget this. In order for us to truly be these United States of America, we must be as one. We must. And it is a struggle, I know. But we must never, ever forget America. To agitate by the grace of God Almighty. Agitate. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Agitate.
Good evening. We'd like to play for you something that we know that Frederick Douglass had in his personal music collection that he would have heard in his home with his family. It's an arrangement of the Blue Danube Waltz.
first Emancipation Day commemoration was celebrated 4 years after the passage of the D.C. Emancipation Act. This was also the first anniversary following the end of the Civil War. And that particular celebration began, people wanted to celebrate it. The war was over, and this was just one of many sort of celebrations around the country.
Great day, the righteous marching, great day. God's gonna build up Zion's wall, great day.
On April 19, 1866, thousands of spectators lined the streets of D.C. on a sunny day to see the parade. The only visual depiction is a drawing from Harper's Weekly magazine.
What you would see would be the parade beginning at a certain place that had been pre-established. And it would generally open with the president of the parade in sort of an open carriage. And then all of these various militia groups. Following the Civil War, many of the black veterans and persons who had been in what would be equivalent to a National Guard continued these paramilitary activities. Rain or shine, many of the Emancipation Day parades saw rain. The people were still out. They would have umbrellas or they would just be wet and bedraggled. And they marched all over town. Can you imagine marching that distance today? I mean, we can barely go 5 or 6 blocks. These people went all over town. Then after the parade, they would convene at some spot and then have speeches.
The first black person elected to Congress from Virginia, John Mercer Langston, was a regular speaker. He took part in the unveiling of the Emancipation Memorial in Lincoln Park on April 14, 1876.
It depicts a kneeling man of color breaking his chains, and a statue then of Lincoln handing him the Emancipation Proclamation.
The monument was funded entirely by the contributions of freed slaves. The man, Archer Alexander, was the last person to be captured under the Fugitive Slave Act. Emancipation speeches conveyed awareness by acknowledging the lack of rights for people of color. Not unlike the Civil Rights Act that followed, the Emancipation Act freed slaves on paper, but denial of basic rights continued in practice.
And one of the speakers in one of the Emancipation Day celebrations said this, that the Emancipation Act freed us physically as slaves, but we are still political slaves. And that is as true today as it was then.
With the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, slavery was abolished and African Americans were given the right to vote. Despite the progress, newly freed blacks faced an array of daunting social obstacles. To deal with these issues, the Union began an era known as Reconstruction. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Representative Thaddeus Stevens were among a group of congressional members known as Radical Republicans, who dedicated themselves to crafting Reconstruction legislation aimed at protecting and educating freedmen until they were able to provide for themselves.
The most important piece of legislation that was introduced by these Radical Republicans was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or Freedmen Bureau, which was the bureau that was established as a result of public policy to provide education, housing, medical, employment, and opportunities for African Americans.
Established in 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was headed up by Civil War hero, Union Army General Oliver Howard. In his role as commissioner of the Bureau, Howard promoted the welfare and education of former slaves.
He played an integral part in establishing schools for African Americans. Howard University is one of those schools that come out of the Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1867, as well as schools here in Washington, D.C. that were established on the land of what we know today as Berry Farms, a farm that was owned by James Berry.
Another hero of the Freedmen's Bureau was Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson. Wilson began his career as a shoemaker, but went on to become a leading abolitionist. Wilson was instrumental in crafting legislation to end slavery and also served as the vice president on the Ulysses S. Grant.
After he became vice president and president of the Senate, he continued his roles to fight for African Americans for civil rights and liberties and equalities, and so he's a great hero. I can never emphasize enough that he was author of the D.C. compensated emancipation legislation that became law and freed enslaved people here in the District of Columbia, our first on 16 April 1862.
During Reconstruction, former slaves were given the right to vote, and as a result, the nation's first black senators were elected. But the advances would not continue. With the controversial election of 1876 and the Jim Crow laws that followed, much of the historic gains during Reconstruction would evaporate.
So that is our film, Enslavement to Emancipation. Just short snippets this evening. And we're hoping that it will encourage you to continue the conversation at home. So you can always go on YouTube to watch the full-length version. I'm going to pivot now to our next Douglass quote, and then we'll kick off our conversation.
Was truly a great advantage. I assert most unhesitantly that the religion of the South is a mere covering for the most horrid crimes, a justifier of the most appalling barbarity, a sanctifier of the most hateful fraud, and a dark shelter which the darkest, foulest, grossest, and most infernal deeds of slaveholders find the strongest protections.
Now, taking a look at that quote, it's apparent that some northern states had opposing views of slavery and equality than those states in the South, both during slavery and post-emancipation. How did that mentality affect and extend into the civil rights era?
I would say one of the ways in which that mentality extended through the civil rights era is that in the South, people were upfront about how they felt and thought, and in the North, people did it the kind of backdoor okie dokie way, right? So there's a great journal article by these two sociologists at, I think they're both at Duke now, and basically what they do is they look at patterns of residential segregation in the North, comparing the North to the South, right? From the 1870s until the 1970s. And one of the things that they find is that, especially in the post-emancipation era, basically up until the 1950s, you saw this pattern of segregation in the South where people were content with black folk living right near them because they needed them. I mean, you were going to come, you had to clean my house and take care of my kids. We had Jim Crow codes, so you knew your place. In the North, because there weren't Jim Crow codes, they needed to establish residential segregation, and people understood that their status was associated with the neighborhood that they lived in, right? And that's how you understood your place in the North if you were black.
I think also that what it did was that it took away the right to vote for blacks in the South. And that became an incredible hammer because afterwards, After Reconstruction, we were electing black people into Congress and state legislation and all of that. But when they set up the system, it affected civil rights, and it moved. It just took away the right to vote, basically. It took away our major piece of freedom to decide what we could do, what we needed, what we wanted. And it was because of, I think, the civil rights movement who began to see the necessity of voting. And more than anything else, the history of the civil rights movement was about the right to vote. It was not about accommodation. It got construed, and people thought, well, we're in the civil rights movement so that blacks can go into restaurants and blacks can do that. The whole concept was about the right to vote, jobs, and equality and justice. But when that was taken away from us, but it was only through the civil rights movement and through civil rights workers who started in the early 60s, who went into these small towns in the South and started to re-register people, SNCC and CORE and NAACP and all of them. But the other thing that it did was that it began to awaken the sleeping giant in the North, because it was okay for blacks in the South, for whites to do that to blacks in the South, but when blacks in the North started to look for better working conditions and wanted more voting rights and redistricting, then it became a different era, a different piece of cake here. And so the voting legislation was the most impactful thing that it could do in terms of keeping the people down after the Civil War. It just took everything away from it, because once you make a law and you can't vote to undo it, then what do you have? But it was through the struggle of the civil rights movement that civil rights workers, both black and white, understood the power of the vote in the South.
Could I just comment on that also? You know, a Baptist preacher once said, if you're going to take a text, you ought to stick with it a little bit, wrestle with it a little bit before you put it down. The quote does say, talks about the religion of the South, which is a lot of which still prevails. I mean, a lot of those Southern preachers still preach slaves, obey your master, which is in the Bible. And what the civil rights movement did, I'm proud to say I was a part of a group called SNCC that went to Mississippi. We took those same songs and turned them into freedom songs. Yeah. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Ain't gonna let Jim Crow turn me around. Right. We hijacked that whole thing and used it as fighting words. And let me just say that we were all meeting in those churches in the South. Why were we meeting in those churches? Because, as I said earlier, Russell Adams said, when we found our newfound freedom, what did we do? We started churches and schools. Yeah. So the civil rights movement had hundreds of churches and schools.
Freedom schools. Freedom
schools that we, as a matter of fact, in most of those little towns, the church was the only thing we owned. Yeah. We were living on these plantations. We were renting from somebody. We didn't own anything but the church. So that's where we had all our meetings, and we used those songs. And Martin Luther King, you know, who was the leader of the civil rights movement in the 60s, was a good Baptist preacher, trained at a good Baptist school, Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, where I later went. So I think that it was true that we were able to take those freedom songs and turn them into fighting songs. And I can tell you, if you have never had this happen to you, I remember coming out of one of those little houses, churches in Sunflower, Mississippi, with Miss Fannie Lou Hamer leading one of those freedom songs. And the sheriff was standing out there with all his posse when he saw us come out of that church singing, and we started singing and speaking in tongue and parted the water. They moved out of the way, let us go through. We didn't know how we were going to get there. But they were scared of us because they knew we had something going, and they were not about to get out there and try to stop us. So let me speak a word on that, because I think that's important to understand about African Americans. We have made this something that would work for us powerfully, and those churches and schools work together. Many of these colleges, Howard University started at a church. Morehouse College started a church in Augusta, Georgia. Many of these colleges started in churches. So by the time we get to 1890, there are 100 black colleges in the United States, thousands of schools, and thousands of churches. So it's a wonderful story that I think, you know, we tell the story to African Americans at the War Museum. So you're all welcome to come by to see us whenever you get a chance.
That's a shameless plug right there. He's just plugging. Well played, well played. let's take a look at our next Douglass quote.
The name given me by my mother was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. I, however, had dispensed with the two middle names long before I left Maryland, so I was generally known by the name of Frederick Bailey.
So let's talk about names. We know that slaves were often given names by their slave holders or purchasers. How has that affected our efforts, modern day efforts, to try to trace our lineage, now knowing that perhaps our family name may have changed hands numerous times?
I think when you listen to some African American students who are very interested in retracing their ancestry to Africa, you learn a lot from them. And particularly as an African, I have been learning a lot from my students at Howard University. I could just mention the case of one student who is really has done a lot of research through agencies and so on, and ended up retracing his ancestry to the Yoruba of Nigeria. And that has dynamized this young man to the point that he's all over the place in a constructive and positive way to reclaim what was taken from African Americans. To do his little piece, as he sees it, to say what was taken from us has to be reconquered by us. And I think as an African also, when I see in African American families, young girls and young boys whose names are not those traditional European Christian names. And sometimes when you hear those names being pronounced, in some quarters you hear giggling, people making fun of those names. When you hear a young African American in Bloomington, Indiana being called Shaka Zulu, because that's what he wants to be called, because he is using that to reclaim his Africanity. Even if his ancestors were not from South Africa, it doesn't matter, because Africa is one in the eyes and heart of this young man. So I think there is a visible, a tangible approach to challenging maybe not the name of Jackson, Johnson, Williams, or so on, but what is underneath that, what that hides, the forest that the tree hides. And that, for an African, it is very refreshing to me to see my brothers and sisters here in America continuing to fight that fight, and I'm hopeful we'll win it.
And remember also that names that were given, right, for purposes of enslavement, families also gave names that were remembered and passed down in families, right? So he was Frederick to his slave owners, right? But he may have been something else to his grandmother, right? So names do get passed down in that way. A few years ago, a young woman did a documentary called My Name is Eve, where she explored this very subject of naming in the African American community and its significance. And so she traced all of these elements of links to Africa. So we know that what somebody is called outwardly is not always how he or she names himself.
How they identify themselves. Has sites like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, I think it's called, have those sites made it easier for folks to trace their lineage?
Absolutely. We at the African American Civil War Memorial, we have 209,000 names of blacks who joined the Union Army to fight in the Civil War. We started working on this in 1992. You had to do all this on the back of postcards. And since then, of course, the computer era, and now all of the various things, including Ancestry.com, People do work harder at this now. I think the movie Roots probably did more than anything else to really embolden a whole generation of people to care about their family history. But let me just point out that following the Civil War, you know, the 13th Amendment had in it a provision for blacks to relocate to Africa, who wanted to leave the United States. It actually would pay them their way over there. And there was a robust Back to Africa movement right after the Civil War, the same as there was after the Civil Rights Movement. When SNCC broke up with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that I went to Mississippi with, many of our SNCC people went to Africa. Bob Moses and a whole tribe of young blacks from SNCC went to Tanzania. And of course, everybody knows that Stokely Carmichael, who was president of SNCC, went to Africa and changed his name to Sekou Touré because he wanted to establish that relationship between African Americans here in the U.S. and Africa. So that effort to try to reconnect ourselves to our roots has gone on quite substantially for a long time, and I think it will continue in the future. And you know, I work with a group that tried to establish a financial economic relationship with Africa. We wanted to import some oil and set up some company and give some money to the United Negro College Fund. Something like that is going to happen one day too. It hasn't happened yet, but it is going to happen because we get more sophisticated as we go, and we will have better international relations with our own people back home, a better relationship in the future.
Okay, let's go to our next Douglass quote.
We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and the future.
So it seems like we never have enough time to really go in depth with the next topic, and this is probably one of them. Continental Africans and people of African descent are often spoken of as two different, distinct groups. Other people do believe that we are one and the same. Let's discuss for a moment the cultural identity of the two. How do they differ, and what our connections are? How has this dynamic shifted over time, Africans and African Americans?
So that we should have just done the whole show on this.
Right.
So I'm going to do a shameless plug. In the fall, I have a book coming out on African American engagement with Africa. So that's not an issue we can deal with in a second, which is probably what we all have here, right? So it's a long and complicated relationship. The relationship between African Americans and Africans, we're all not the same. African Americans themselves are not all the same. My mother's from Massachusetts. She's an 89-year-old woman from Massachusetts who perhaps her experiences may not resonate with a woman the same age from Tennessee, right? So there are many, many black communities, but there are things, on which we are the same. We agree on. Our sensibilities, perhaps, are the same. Our history, right, is the same the history of oppression we all can relate to. So I think there are many fronts and many places where we can find commonalities and celebrate our differences.
Yeah, and just to echo that, just within this country, there are all kinds of black folk, right? And Africa is a continent, so every country has its own culture, and within each country, there are multiple cultures. And let's not forget, there are other people of African descent, right? You know, of the diaspora, there are people all over the Caribbean, Latin America, and there's just this huge complexity and mosaic of what it means to be black, right? I mean, one of the things that I always find so interesting is that in this country, people conflate the identity African American with black, right? Black is a racial designation. It's this umbrella designation. African American is an ethnicity that's meant to actually think about people's like shared cultural, right, identity.
Support from the back.
Yeah, thank you. Are there some demographers out there? Is that so yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm sure there are many things that we share, but just as every single, individual here who's not white, who's not black, who comes from a culture that is, I don't know, whatever. I mean, we are also unique in our own ways.
I think there's also one other thing which I'd just like to pitch in right quick, and that is, I remember the first time I went to South Africa. On a Sunday morning, I woke up. I'd been traveling, so I turned on the television in this hotel room, and I saw this BET television was on in South Africa. And on Sunday morning, they had these people, these South Africans, that were lip-singing American gospel music for the Winans. And I said to myself, black culture, American culture, through the media is probably going to be the thing that's going to connect the Africans and African Americans because of the phenomenon. That was 15 years ago. And then today, you know, there's a movie out there now that's the Black Panther, which is
Haven't heard of it.
No spoilers, please. I want to say, this is not a plug for the movie, but I do want to say one thing about it, and that is that up until last year, actually, what I was told by the movie industry was that the reason why you don't see any black leads in these major movies is because there's no secondary market for blacks, black heroes. And the secondary market for American music American movies is in Europe. That's where the primary is US, the secondary is Europe. And black lead characters don't play well over there except for Will Smith and a couple of others. But this movie has a different dynamic to it. Remember, this whole movie is set to take place in Africa. So now we're gonna see if this is gonna actually do what we think it might do, which is to create a secondary market for a major blockbuster movie in Africa. And it'll be interesting to see if it makes it over there. I mean, that means there's got to be infrastructure supported, there got to be people willing to pay to go see it, and we'll see what happens. But these popular movies and popular culture and new devices that are available now are going to have a way of bringing Africans and African Americans together, and as we share this culture not only with Africa but also with the rest of the world.
We have one more. I'm sorry to interrupt. We have one more minute before we go to the next quote. I saw that you wanted to interject.
Yeah, very quickly. I would like to say that the brand of Pan-Africanism that was created from the Caribbean and amplified here in North America and transported into Africa, what Africans consider as a gift to the motherland from the New World, that is reviving today. When you listen to those young people, young men and women, through social media, through popular culture from the United States and from Africa and from the Caribbean and elsewhere, they seem to understand that really we are all different, but we have something stronger in common. If we focus on that, our differences are not going to get the best of that. So I am seriously, hopeful that by the turn of this century, I won't be here, but there will be a lot of progress done in that area.
Well said, well said. With that, let's go to our next Douglass quote.
Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them.
In light of some of the injustices that we face today, be it racial, religious, sexuality, disability, what are some of the things that the everyday person can do to advocate?
Well, I think that the everyday person needs to kind of look at themselves and not try to take on the world, but figure out one thing that you can do that will make you feel that you're doing something better for somebody else, not just for yourself. I think that we need to find our niche. One of the things that we learned in the civil rights movement is that everybody couldn't do everything, but people could figure out what they could do. Some people say they couldn't march, they just couldn't take it, but they could write checks. There were other people who couldn't march because if they had marched, they would have lost their job because they were working for Miss Susie. But when we come in from a march, they had a big pot of collard greens and cornbread waiting for us. So people find ways of finding what your niche is. And so when we start to talk about how we can come together as one people, not only in how we as people can look out for seniors. There are many seniors that just a hello or a check. I'm gonna knock on Miss Susie's door. I'm going to the Safeway. Do you need anything? Just little things. We don't need to do a lot of big things in terms of trying to turn the world over. Just simple things, but find something that you can do once a week that you know is going to make a difference in somebody's life. If it's no more than saying good morning with a smile.
Right. That's right.
It makes a difference.
Those are wonderful words to end our conversation. I think something that will be enlightening that we could take home with us. We could talk all night long, but we don't have all night. So thank you so much to our panel. Another round of applause. Thank you so much for enlightening us with your discussions. Being a creature of the present and past was troubling. I longed for a future too, with hope in it. The desire to be free, awakened by determination to act, to think, and to speak. We hope that you leave here tonight equally as determined to make a difference in your own communities. I can't thank you enough for allowing me to celebrate and to commemorate this important moment in history with you. Thank you for coming out this evening. And before we leave, I'd like us to all celebrate the community that we've built here tonight, right? Doesn't this feel good? So we're going to join in a communal selection of Lift Every Voice and Sing.